So I'm going to go ahead and call our working session to order, our work session to order. This meeting will not go till 1 a.m. We have a hard stop at 8 o'clock, and we will stop at 8 o'clock or earlier. So we'll go ahead and turn it over to Clint.
All right, thank you. So tonight we'll be having a work session over some proposed short-term rental amendments. So these ordinance amendments were drafted approximately a year ago, but I'll just kind of go through a real quick recap of kind of the topics we're going to discuss tonight. One, I'll do a kind of a brief recap, I think, of the amendments. I think most of you were on council when we talked about this in March. I think we do have maybe one new individual since then. So if there's some additional questions that we can provide some context, I'm happy to do so. We have representatives from our Housing and Neighborhood Services Department here tonight as well. They'll be discussing a little bit about the enforcement side of short-term rentals. That was something that came up at the work session in March. So they'll be detailing a little bit of their side and how they look at the application administration of some of the short-term rental regulations. And then there's some data and some information that was requested from that work session in March. We'll go through that, kind of look at some of the statistics, some of the kind of disbursement of some of the short-term rentals here in town. And then also there was some questions about the revenue, so we do have a slide on that as well. And so there's a list of attachments on the right. I won't go through each of those individually, but there's some information we provided in response, I think, to some of the March requests, as well as some of the information we also provided in March as well, including the correspondence we'd received from the public during the initial public hearing, P&Z correspondence that kind of outlines the proposed changes at that time, kind of gives some context on why they were doing that, and some of the solutions that were proposed at that time. There's a flow chart as well and some other information. So just a quick project history. I'm not going to read all this either, but generally the short-term rental regulations, they became effective in mid-2024, so June 2024. Mid-2025, there was a year in review meeting, or a proposal, not a proposal, but a presentation at council. Conversation at that point kind of focused on perhaps looking at streamlining the short-term rental process, perhaps making the regulatory process more streamlined. And I think in regards to especially the conditional use process, which does add a layer of complexity to the short-term rental license process. That additional amendments to the short-term rental kind of went through the planning and zoning process, was approved by planning and zoning in June 2025. We had a work session earlier this year, again in March 26th, to look at those amendments, and continued till tonight. So that's kind of where we pick up the conversation. Again, just kind of recap some of the goals from that mid-2025 conversation that staff had with the council. One was looking really to reduce the complexity. There was multiple tiers to the short-term rental program. And within those tiers, there's also some additional layers. There's different day kind of thresholds for inside those tiers. So that was one goal, was to look at seeing if we could simplify kind of the regulatory framework. Also creating a more direct path to licensure, and that speaks a little bit more to that conditional use process. As you're familiar with, conditional use versus administrative, those are really the two pathways to getting a license within the community. Administrative is something that is generally reviewed by our staff and issued usually a business license and then also a rental compliance license by our H&S staff. Without a public process, the conditional use process adds several months to that, requires public hearings, and eventually requires a discretionary hearing and approval by city council. So it definitely includes longer time frames and some of that uncertainty that goes along with that process. Overall, the goals though were to kind of retain kind of what we call the integrity of what was established. So retain kind of some of those night limit thresholds within the code itself. So these amendments really we're looking at, there's a 30-day option that we were looking to really combine with other ones, and we'll talk about that a little bit with some of the graphics I have. But really kind of simplifying the how many nights are allowed and kind of combining some of those tiers into one to make it a little simpler to understand, simpler to administer. And by doing that, we also looked at the conditional use. So when you have a conditional use, there's usually requirements or triggers, right? What triggers someone to need a conditional use? So that's really I think the key, kind of the principal factor that we'll be looking at tonight. What are those conditional use factors? What requires someone getting a license to go through that? And so we are proposing changes to that. Those are probably the most significant change within those purported amendments. So it's really moving away from looking at the ownership, whether it's a long-term or an owner-occupant versus someone who is an owner-occupant being the threshold, to being a threshold of specific factors that come into play that might result in council wanting to be able to evaluate a certain property. And so it's more of an outcome-based review. So is this property within 300 feet of another one? That could trigger coming through conditional use process, and whether there are code violations. And those are the two things I think through staff's experience in this have been really the main topics of conversation. And so it makes sense to say if those are the things that people are most concerned about, those might likely be the best reasons to facilitate a license being elevated from an administrative to a conditional use permit. You might recognize this chart. This is really where we spent a lot of time in March, and it's kind of our attempt to simplify really the changes. So I'll just spend kind of a few minutes, I think, getting everyone back up to speed with really the regulations that we have now and what we're proposing to change. So the left chart is where we're at now. That's our current tier system and our current night limits. And the right would be our amended tier system. So the dashed line there really signifies the difference, I think, of the combination of a couple tiers or a couple layers almost within tiers. So you can see that tier one in our current regulations on the left side had a 30-night allowance. So if you were going to rent it out less than 30 nights, you could get a tier one. Also, if you're going to rent it out 120 nights, you could be in kind of the lowest layer of tier two. And those are significant because at tier one and lower level of tier two required you to be a principal resident. So an owner occupant, essentially, you had to own that property and you had to live there the majority of the year. So we'll look through some of the charts too, and I won't get into all this right now, but that 30-night is very, very lowly utilized. I think there's only a couple or three licenses that we've issued for that tier one. So in order to kind of simplify that, and in recognition it's not really being used, we're going to combine that, and that's on the right side. So really, the 30-night and the 120-night on the left side is being combined into one general tier one on the right side, and we'll call that our lower level tier one because it is 120 nights, but there are a couple other layers to our tier one as well. So the caveat there now is we're really removing that distinction of principal resident for that tier one, the above the dashed line. So that's really the big distinction going from our current regulations to our new regulations, is we won't really be looking at whether you are a principal resident or not. We want to kind of level the playing field to make it simple for everyone participating in the short-term rental market. And that basically eliminates the need to distinguish between those two, because another thing I think we found is when we went to a conditional use process or a permit review process, whether a property was owned by an owner-occupant for a 210 night, and we'll talk about that a little bit, or it was someone who wasn't an owner-occupant, wasn't necessarily a defining factor when we were reviewing those. It didn't come up in conversation, it didn't come up during public testimony that the ownership was a principal cause of concern. So again, that's kind of why we went back, I think, and focused on what we saw as the principal points of concern, and said maybe that's what we need to focus on and when we make something a conditional use. So I'll focus real quick on really below the dashed line. So we're going to ignore kind of the two bottom lines. So that's tier 3 currently, and our new 2 tier, if we went to that, it's commercial. It's really not changing at all, so we won't spend much time there. So we're really looking as the 210 nights So those are the middle two rows on each of those charts. Right now, as you can see, when we get up to a 210-night Tier 2 distinction, the distinction between ownership model goes away there, because once you go past that 210 or past that 120 and you're into a 210, then essentially we're saying no one's an owner occupant anymore, because that's more than half the year, right? So everybody is essentially now operating as if they won't be living there full-time or more than half the time of the year. So at that stage, what distinguished at that point whether you can get an administrative or not, or a conditional use license, now fell to zoning. And so if you're in a residential zoning currently, you had to go through a conditional use process, and that meant everyone. So that meant individuals who own the property but maybe live there less than half the year. It also involved anyone who might be an LLC. And an LLC, we've talked a little bit too, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on that, but an individual can have a property in an LLC and still be an owner occupant. They could still be an owner. They could also be an out-of-town investor. So we provided some data, I think, on how that broke down, but I don't want to necessarily read too much into what that means. But the CUP at that point became a zoning concern. So if you're in a residential district, everyone went through a conditional use process. And that's where we see most of our conditional uses, and that's where we focused, I think, a little more on how do we streamline some of the applications coming through that CUP process in that Tier 2, where we can maybe transfer some of those to administrative. So then you go over to the right side and we look at our 210 nights over there. What we've done is change the triggers for our conditional use to focus again on the factors and concerns that came up most often in hearing, testimony, and through public body evaluation. And that's whether or not where you were located, you were within 300 feet of another property. So you might know that is one of our conditional use criteria now that can be used as part of the evaluation. We like to say that it's not determinative. It doesn't mean that if you're within 300 feet that you would be denied. It just means you can use that as part of a cumulative evaluation of whether or not to approve that conditional use permit. It can be one thing that you use in your evaluation, but you can also take things from the other 5 criteria or an additional criteria from our standard conditional use permit too, and use that in your determining factors. So it's more of a cumulative approach than one determinative factor, that 300 feet. What we do here, though, is the 300 feet then would become the central factor, or one of the 2 factors that would require you to go through the conditional use process. If you were not within 300 feet, and the other factor being code violations, if you didn't have any current code violations with the city, you could go through it administratively. So right now, there is no avenue, if you're in a residentially owned zoned property, to get a 210-night license without going through conditional use. This would open up the opportunity for a 210-night license to be approved administratively, as long as you didn't hit those 2 triggers, the 300 feet and the code violations. If you did one or the other, then you would come in front of Planning and Zoning and City Council for evaluation for the approval of a conditional use permit. And then that 300 feet could be used in the evaluation of whether to approve or to deny that permit. So that's really one of the, I think, the most distinct change within these amendments. And that is really, I think, looking at the opportunity that would come along with perhaps allowing more of the 210-night applications to go through that administrative process. And we'll look a little bit on how many of the CUPs or how many of the applications and licenses we're getting are actually conditional use processes. So that's my quick recap of that. We did kind of want to pick up a little bit more in depth with our H&S staff to kind of go over some of their information. But before I kind of kicked it over to them, I'd be happy to answer any questions about this, just so maybe we all have kind of a broad understanding, I think, of what the amendments are.
Go ahead, Christine. Did you have questions?
Yeah, I do have.
Microphone.
I do have a couple of questions, and I'm newest, so I was hoping maybe other people would go first. But what was the basis for the 120 versus 210 versus 365?
So one, I'll offer some apologies. Our planning manager, Pat Zinner, wasn't able to attend tonight, and he has been here through that whole process and has a lot of kind of that historical context. So I'll do the best I can, kind of going back and
Okay.
and explaining, I think, some of the nuances of these tiers. I think from my understanding, the distinction really in the, where we're at currently, the 30 nights was really intended to allow an avenue for owner occupants, so people who own their property and lived in them, to be able to have a kind of a fairly kind of low threshold to be able to participate in the short-term rental market. It actually, we didn't get into the details here, but right now, if you do the 30-night tier, you don't have to provide any additional parking than you have on site. So you could have up to 8 guests, no additional parking. The 120 nights, I think based on, planning and zoning's kind of research and our staff's research seemed to be kind of, a threshold that was being used a little bit. So it's not quite the 180 days, which would be over half the year. So it kind of represents that maybe midway point where we would also consider them to be a owner occupant. So that's the 120 days. And then the 10-night gets us past that halfway of the year part. So that may not be the best explanation, I think, for those tiers, but I think that's kind of how we wound up with those specific nights in our tiers. So the 120, 210, and 365.
Okay. And, oh, do you have a follow-up? Okay. Totally different question. You mentioned the ownership not being a principal reason for concerns. But I feel like since I've been on council, when people come up, they say, hey, there's, this person doesn't understand our neighborhood, they're not living here, I feel like I hear that. Was there like an analysis of the meetings done, or how did you guys determine that that wasn't one of the concerns?
Well, I will caveat with it that this was drafted in summer of last year, so we definitely have had some additional conditional use permits come through council, and that hasn't incorporated some of the feedback I think we've gotten since then. So that's one thing that's kind of important to note. I think looking through the testimony for this is, yes, I think people were concerned with, not having owners there, not having them to be there, more than half the time. I think most of the concerns really were focused on the density within areas, right? The frequency within a particular ward, and also the particular upkeep of that property. So I think, yes, the loss of having a resident there was a concern. I think the more specific concerns we had were those two things, was the density and perhaps the concern that someone operating this site has not been properly maintaining their property in the past, and therefore we are concerned with their ability to, I think, properly operate and administer a short-term rental going forward.
Okay, and then I have one more question. For the code violations, is there a threshold on violations that we'd automatically deny that we just wouldn't even have to look at?
Not that I'm aware of. Nothing that's in the code that would automatically, I think, deny a license or cause that license to be rejected. I know H&S staff's here too. There may be something just in the general rental requirements that would do that, and it doesn't seem to be the case. So no, there's nothing in the code that would contemplate one specific violation that would preclude someone from getting a license.
Is that something we've considered or talked about at any point, or?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay, thanks. That's my questions for now.
All right, Vera?
Yeah. So one of my questions, Christina already got to part of it, so I appreciate that. But I was also wondering, because I also kind of keyed in on that comment about owner-occupied not being a concern of the public, because one of the other things I hear that seems tied to that is the concern about availability of housing for owners. And so owner-occupied feels tied to that issue as well. And then my other question, I suppose that one was more of a comment anyway. My question is, so if principal residence, because you're talking about principal residence only being an option for the 30 nights and the 120 nights, because at 210, you're over half of the year. Does that take into account like Airbnbs that are just part of a residence, like when they have a mother-in-law suite or a room that they are renting out? So they could have it rented out 210 days of the year and still live there?
I think as soon as you apply for that Tier 2 license, it really doesn't matter if you're a owner occupant or just an owner. You still have to go through that CUP process. The license is the same generally.
Okay, thank you.
And Clint, I will say there too, just one thing on that, one of the conditions, so if you do apply for the 210, you'll have to go through the CUP process currently, and one of the conditions that you can consider as part of the CUP is whether the registrant lives there. And so to that
Okay.
extent, it does kind of come into consideration in that way.
Okay, thank you for that clarity.
Yeah, a lot of good questions so far. Can I ask, are we going over questions right now just on the text change summary table?
Yeah, I think there's
Or
more
we-
information to come later in the slides, because I know I have questions and I realized they were later in the
Yeah, yeah.
slideshow, so.
Yeah, a lot of good questions. I can say that the owner type stood out to me as well. I heard quite a bit of questions regarding ownership. I'm not sure that the questions called out the different types of ownership as to principal residence or not. But in discussion of the ordinance, I do hear that brought up frequently. One of my frustrations with how this ordinance has been working for us so far is that it's not well administered in a way that achieves the goals that we had. So some of the goals were preserving affordable housing. Some of the goals were limiting impacts to neighbors and nuisances. Some of the goals were protecting single-family housing. And the only ones that I have seen us vote no to are when there's some sort of demonstrated neglect on the applicant, right? So we're not able to really account for any other issue in the way that I've seen it actually administered, or at least for the ones that come to us. I think a lot of my questions on this slide, what's the main difference between, in the future, what will be Tier 1 and Tier 2? Is it just the number of nights still?
Tier 1 and Tier 2. So that's really, once you get into Tier 2, you're looking at commercial zoning.
Right.
So then you're really, we've eliminated, and that's kind of the way it is now. So there's no real night cap on it. It's 365 nights.
I see. So here's what I'm asking, though, right? The difference in our perception of this is it's more commercial operation as you move to Tier 2. How do we designate that? What is the difference in applicants? Is it only the nights? You're less commercial if you're less than 365 nights, and you're more commercial if you're available up to 365?
It's Tier 1's really is utilized for residential zoning, and then Tier 2 is utilized in commercial zoning.
In commercial zoning
Yeah.
only. So the difference between Tier 1 and Tier 1 CUP, code violations in 300 feet.
Yeah. And so that's and I could have explained it probably a little bit more in depth. So the plus and minus in that far right column is the CUP row there where Tier 1 CUP, 210 nights. The plus 300 feet and code violations means those two things would trigger a conditional use permit. Where you see the minus in front of them and the rows above that means as long as you don't trigger those, you don't go through a CUP process. So you can't get those licenses if you have either of those two triggers. And one thing I think it's probably worth pointing out, I know we're talking about the principal resident and whether or not that was a factor, I think, in these. I think one thing I would point out is we've removed that from the tier one kind of as a consideration. So now, whether or not technically you live there or not, you would be available. You would have that 100-night or 120-night possibility available, but you're still limited to 120 nights. So in essence, it really is limited to the same factors that a principal resident was limited to before. So you can't rent it for more than half the year. So it kind of removes the distinction of whether you're physically living there, but it still caps the number of nights similar to what the principal resident was capped at. So just a little context.
So one of the things I was having a hard time parsing out, just in understanding this table and the data that you gave us, and I know we're not there yet, but I kind of want to see it on this table. How many admin tier one principal residents did we have apply?
Tier one admin, and that might be on the chart. So, and I'd say we do end with this as well, so I thought we would kind of go through the enforcement part, go through some of the charts, and then end back on this chart for some further discussion.
Sure.
So we could kind of look at the chart and then maybe end with that as well.
Yeah, I can go over that at the end if we're going to circle back to this. I think my question is it the nights that makes it more commercial? And where is it that we are drawing that line? And where in this are we protecting housing availability? I'm not sure that the 300 feet has been successful in doing that. And so I'm pretty reticent to give up the principal residence. Now, to me, if you live there any part of the year, it is a residence and it is a residential use. If you don't live there at all, it's a full commercial use. And that's a key distinction I see. It's also a key distinction for affordability because you are defraying the cost of ownership by being allowed to rent out your house as an STR. Kind of like Vera brought up, I'm concerned because when we wrote this, I thought that someone's mother-in-law suite or whatever extra housing would put them into tier one unless they were the tier one over 120 nights. And I'm concerned that we don't have a route for admin approvals. I'm also concerned about the assumption that if you're renting 365 days, you don't live there at all. Because I'm not sure if that's true or not, and I would certainly like it to be an available option for people who may wish to apply. I'm
Betsy?
good for now.
Initially, I thought one of the reasons, a couple of reasons, the principal resident was, as Valerie says, to help with defraying costs of maintaining a home. And it sounds like we've gotten rid of that with the new tier system. You don't have to live there, and you can rent it for at least 120 days. Why bother to limit it to that? Because it appears that we're just going to commercial. Like if you have a short-term rental, you want to rent it, you own the property, or you and the bank do, you can rent it. So why are we even, I mean, this doesn't look to me like we're doing anything about affordable housing or trying to be supportive of people that are trying to make a little extra money, which was the way these short-term rentals started. I mean, this sounds to me like we're just going more towards commercial. Am I missing the point here, or are we just going to commercial and not really worrying about neighborhoods and affordable housing?
Well, I think it goes back to, some of the stated goals for the amendments. And from looking back at the materials, I think The concerns and issues that were raised were really the timeframes that was anticipated to process all these conditional use permits. And I would say there's going to be a chart here where we kind of look at the timeline of a lot of those permits, and there was a big peak mid-year last year, and those have kind of tailored off.
Would it be reasonable to go and look at those slides then versus getting hung up on this particular slide?
But I just kind of, I think
Sorry,
I'd
guess I
respond to
cut
the
you off.
one
I didn't
part.
mean to, sorry.
Yeah, no, I just respond to the, I think the question about kind of eliminating I think the sentiment where residents can use this to turn a little bit extra money. That's still there. That's still under that 120 nights. What we've really done is saying, well, we're going to allow you also to do 210 nights, even if you're a principal resident, right?
Or we're allowing you not to live there at all and rent it
Correct.
in a residential area.
Yes, as long as you don't, if you don't meet that kind of distance requirement and the code requirement, or the code violation requirement, you can get that administrative,
But
right?
we're wishy-washy on that 300 feet, though. So that would be, and it's still wishy-washy, right? Plus, minus.
Well, who's wishy-washy? The code is 300 feet right now.
Yeah, but you want to change that.
The 300 feet right now is within our conditional use criteria. We would now make it a condition that would require them to go through the conditional use process. So that would be the criteria. If you're a resident, you can still do the 120 night. If you're a principal resident, you can still do that 120 night. You still have some of that additional kind of relaxed standards for parking. But now what we've done is essentially say, anybody can come and there's a administrative pathway now for anyone to get to 210 night. And so that was really aimed, again, I think, at that concern that there'd be too many conditional use permits, that it would not be as streamlined as we'd like. So that was the goal, I think, with these amendments, was to reduce the amount of conditional use permits that we would have to process. And so by doing that, we are opening up an administrative path for residential zoning districts to get to 210. Right now, there is no path. Everyone in a residential zoning district who wants 210 has to come through the conditional use permit process.
Okay.
All right, we've got Christina and then Valerie.
I know we're going to talk about wards later, so I'll hold mine. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. I don't think the code is wishy-washy at all. Here's the questions
Okay.
that I have directly on that, because I think that the interpretation could be confusing to the audience. So, tier one, or not tier one, I don't even know why I said that. This has nothing to do with tiers. The 300 feet. You can't be more than 300 feet from any other STR.
With the
Do we
revisions, the
count
amendments?
that in the way that we're evaluating it currently, I'm going to say?
So
Because
no,
that's,
so that is just a factor. It's not determinative.
sorry.
So
You're
it does
right.
not require a license to be denied if you're within 300 feet.
I'm going to be more simplistic when I do my questions here. That is one area where it feels wishy-washy to the audience. They were factors for consideration. 300 feet is one of them. A lot of people read that as it will be denied if there's something within 300 feet. Now, when you evaluate the 300 feet, do you count admin approvals? So tier one principal residence within the 300 feet?
So when we are evaluating a conditional use permit and say we're in front of planning and zoning, no matter what license or tier it is, if one is within 300 feet, that can be part of the criteria. It meets that criteria, right? When we issue a license for an admin, they don't go through that criteria. So they can be within 300
Yeah.
feet because it's admin.
Now, do you, and I'm not sure if you have yet available any mechanism, do you count unlicensed STRs within
We do not.
300 feet?
No.
I think that's where it feels wishy-washy to the public, because they come to a hearing and they say, I know of 5 STRs right next to me. How is it possible that it's not one within 300 feet? And they're feeling the impacts of those unlicensed STRs, perhaps more. And it's hard for people to follow along what that 300 feet means when that's the physical observation of the condition. I thought that we had an STR, and I was listening to discussion of this. I thought we had an STR recently that was a CUP STR that was adjacent to a commercially zoned STR. So it would have been admin that either didn't make the radius or was added later. And it was called out that there was a certain number of licensed STRs and a certain number including admin licensed STRs.
Yeah, I think there was, as you stated, it is a little complex and maybe somewhat confusing. So I think there was a little bit of confusing guidance given on that. But that is just unequivocally, if you're going through a conditional use process, any license within 300 feet, any licensed STR within 300 feet can be weighed against that factor. You can look at that and say, yes, there is one within 300 feet, so if I voted, if I thought that was a significant enough reason to vote no, that would confirm, or that would support that decision.
Did that answer your questions? Christina, I'm looking at you.
Oh, I have more questions around Ward 5's, or around the clustering.
Okay,
but
yeah, we'll get to that. We'll
it.
get to that. Yeah, so and I know we're getting ready to talk about enforcement, so and I had the same concerns about the unlicensed STRs. I know in the meeting that we had a couple weeks ago with members of the community, some citizens are actively going on different, like AirDNA websites to see how they can find if something is licensed or unlicensed. So when we talk about enforcement, I would love to hear if there's any plans to where citizens could find that information so that they would know whether they need to report versus just calling staff, and then you have to do a whole staff workup to determine if that's licensed or not. So, but I'm sure that will be part of the enforcement discussion.
Because I think we have a program that's supposed to be looking at that, so it'll be interesting to know how that's working.
Yep,
Yep, I think they'll go over that a little bit.
perfect, thank you.
Are we ready for slide 6?
We're doing good.
Yeah?
We have
Okay.
21.
Well, I will-
so
I will-
just want to make sure that we,
40 minutes on the first 5.
appropriately organize our time.
We're coming back at 9 a.m., you guys.
Yeah.
Okay, good evening, council. I'm Bill Rata, the Housing and Neighborhood Services Director, and with me is Lee Kotwitz, our Neighborhood Services Manager. As Clint mentioned earlier, there was some discussion at the March work session that focused on enforcement and some other items that our department is directly involved in on short-term rentals. So tonight, we're going to briefly discuss our department's role in enforcement, talk about some of the complaints that we have received from residents, and we'll also discuss some of the communication efforts that we have been involved in so that we can get information out to the public. And this would include information for a short-term rental operator or a resident who has concerns about an existing short-term rental or a potential short-term rental property. As Lee has spearheaded our department's efforts on these projects and continues to work daily on this topic, I'm going to turn these next few slides over to her.
All right, thank you. Hi, I'm Lee Kotwitz, Neighborhood Services Manager. So I want to share some information about what we're doing with enforcement. Our office works to identify non-compliant properties and reach out to those owners and ask them to come into compliance. So when we identify those properties, we're sending a letter, and the first step is to have them be in touch with community development to start the process. If they pursue that, if they go through the process with community development, then they will come back to Neighborhood Services to get a rental license and also get a business license to get full compliance. We started this process last June, so more than a year ago, and since then, we have opened 169 illegal rental cases. We have started working with our vendor Numo, and they have supplemented the work our staff have done, and they've started sending letters. So the number in this slide is a little higher than what maybe you saw a few days ago, because they've sent about 15 letters just in the last couple of weeks. Identifying potential short-term rentals is fairly easy if we can find the information on the platform sites. If we can match up the pictures on the posting and also make sure that it's current, we can see if it's something that a person could rent for fewer than 30 nights. We also look at reviews. If there's recent reviews, that's a pretty good indication that it's being rented. And also, if we can, again, match up the image of that house with Google Street View so we can verify the address. As you might guess, there are some owners that are pretty sly about this, and it makes it difficult to identify the property, but whenever we can, if we can make a match, we're going to reach out to that owner and let them know that we suspect they're operating a short-term rental and invite them to comply. We generally are giving those owners 30 days to comply. That is the deadline that our vendor is including in their notice. If we don't get a response, again, if we've given them notice, we're not hearing back from them, we have evidence that they continue to operate, then we can put together a case and send it to the prosecutor. Again, if we have good evidence, it's a fairly easy case to make because they are sharing through their posting that they're operating. Our prosecutor has been great about moving forward with those cases, and he usually recommends a fine of $250. And the judge usually agrees with that. The 19 cases we have sent over to prosecution have been on 16 different operators. Most of those are local. 2 of those owners are out of town, and I would say over half of those are owner-occupied structures. Resident complaints, we know, is also a topic of interest. Earlier this year in March, we started a code case type so we could track specific complaints regarding short-term rentals. Since that time, we've got 4 complaints, and that agrees with my history of working in neighborhood services. We just haven't heard a lot of complaints into our office. The 4 complaints that we've received, those were on 2 properties. So 3 complaints on 1 property, 1 complaint on 1 other property. Both of those owners have been referred to prosecution, and one of those is still in process. And I'm shared in this slide the total number of complaints that we've received this calendar year, just for comparison. So we hear from citizens every day, all day long. We just don't hear a lot of chatter about short-term rentals. I will say one of the things that we don't have a good handle on are the calls that might be going to 311. We don't have a good way of knowing what those calls are and what calls might be related to a short-term rental. But I want to share this, that we're not seeing a lot in our office that are concerns from neighbors about short-term rentals. We have tried to ramp up the communication to residents about enforcement of short-term rentals. Our communication staff has put together a great webpage, como.gov/STR. It consolidates all of the information about short-term rentals. So whether you're an owner that needs to comply or you're a resident that wants to file a complaint, all of that information is on that page. With our vendor, we also have a reporting line. This has been up and running for a few months, and again, this website was created, I think, 3 or 4 months ago. We've not received any calls through that line. Again, we have just started to promote this. It was included in the August City Source, so we know that this reporting line is still fairly new to our residents, but it is available. And one of the benefits of this reporting line is it's available 24/7. So it's available for residents to make calls to when our staff is not available to respond to complaints. We've shared with our vendor the name and contact information for the applicant and also the designated agent so they can reach out and try to get issues resolved after hours so that a complainant would have some more immediate response. One of the things I also want to share regarding enforcement is that we have asked for a rental compliance specialist in this new fiscal year, someone who can help us do some additional enforcement and identification of rental properties and short-term rentals so that we can be a little more aggressive in getting properties in compliance. And I'll stop there.
Valerie?
So the hotline number to call if you have a complaint within City Source in August, prior to that, what kind of outreach have we done? What kind of education have we done with the public to let them know that they should be calling this number or neighborhood services for complaints?
There hasn't been special outreach specific to short-term rentals.
I don't think people know that hotline exists. I don't think anyone is calling it. I think they're calling 311.
That very well could be,
And
yes.
people are coming to us and telling us that they're complaining, and we can't register any of these complaints because they don't know where to complain.
Betsy?
DeCarlin, do you have any idea how we can do a better job of communicating with our emergency county folks?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. So with the new process for the NEMO. And so, I mean, that's relatively new. We've had a contract with them for a while, but the process of actually putting the hotline in is relatively new. And so that's now communicating outward on exactly what that looks like. From the 311, we can look and see exactly if those calls are coming into 311, where are they dispatched to? And so that's just going back and checking with the county to see exactly what we
So
have coming in.
Are we able to do that, or are we
can.
not able to do that?
I think that's just a conversation with the county 311 system, see exactly what calls are coming in and how they've been tracked.
And then if they call 311, can we make sure that they get this complaint reporting operating
Well,
line?
I think that's,
Remember?
I think this right here for this is something that we need to do to try to push outward to our community about here's a process on how to respond and how to report on the short-term rentals. So that's something that we need to do now.
That would be
And
good.
so, and I would separate that from the 311 complaints
Okay.
that are coming in.
Well, if we could send out this information now from push this out, the 1-800 number, and then address the 311 number, that'd be great.
Yes.
Sam, I think that would require a specific coding process with the 311, right?
For
Because
the
don't they have
311,
different
yes.
codes?
Yeah.
Because I know Chief Schluty has talked about how they even have sometimes getting data because of the codes that are entered, and everybody interprets those codes differently. So that would definitely be a conversation with the county. So as far as council moving forward, how do we start that conversation?
I think, I would look at, see exactly what's coming in on the 311 system. So just to make sure to see exactly if there is an issue, what does that look like? Because right now, what's happening in the past, it was there's a party or there's a loud noise and I'm making a complaint. I don't want to call 911, so I'll call 311. And then that's not tracking whether or not it's a short-term rental or if it's a regular rental or if it's an owner occupied, it's just a complaint that has come into our home. And so that's a different tracking system. I think for us, as we're looking at short-term rentals, this mechanism will allow us to better track exactly what's going on with short-term rentals and it's trying to get the community to utilize this process as opposed to trying to go through 311 for those type of complaints.
Right, I agree. But speaking of like mining the data from previous, because that was the question.
So that's the question. I'll go back in and I'll actually talk to the communications for the dispatching center see exactly what's going on with the 311 calls, and we can kind of get an idea of the types of calls. The hard part is tracking it to whether or not it's a short-term rental or regular property or how. But we can look at to see what calls have come in.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Valerie, did you have something?
I think you hit on my question pretty clearly. And maybe what I have is not a question, but this is a work session. I don't want to send anyone to joint communications. I don't want to ask joint communications to start coding for this, having spent a lot of time this past year poring over data crime data, call data from our logs. There are too many nuances there for us to report the things that are already coded well and are already known by the people making the call. And it's difficult to draw conclusions. I'm not sure if we can data mine that from the calls either. I think it's incredibly important that we get the information of where to complain accurately out to the citizens.
So your preference, I'm sorry, your priority then would be making sure we get the phone number out and start there versus worrying on what's already happened?
Public education and outreach, I think, I mean, I'm worried about what has already happened, but short of mining the actual call recordings for who said the word STR, and they might not even know it's an STR, it seems like a labor-intensive process to ask our staff to do.
I would think
We
that
have the
that's
right
sort of the
path.
city manager's job, and we're getting in the weeds,
Okay.
you know? I
Fair
mean,
enough.
I agree with you, but I mean, I think we're just in the weeds. So he can check into this, he can look into it, he can tell us that it's too much to mine it, and we'll do it going forward.
Okay,
We can,
so
you know,
my
we're fine.
comment was that I do not want to cloud the where to report message in any way whatsoever.
And I will agree with that. I think the best approach is to get people to use this 1-800 number in order to better track what's going on with our short-term rentals.
Yeah.
And that then goes back to my question on how people can identify if something is a short-term rental as part of that enforcement process, to Valerie's point, that they may not know.
I thought
Well,
that,
they've already been advertised, and again, we're sort of getting in the weeds.
Yep.
I mean, I think the staff should be able to figure this out and come back and tell us. I don't think that's our job to figure this out.
sorry, this was part of our ordinance, or at least I thought that it was when we talked about signage.
And there was
We had
some-
asked them to post number to call for their registered agent, and post, I mean, if you have a plaque in the window that says you're an STR,
Oh,
you know that you're an STR. I thought that we had some kind of signage required.
Not external. I believe it's required for the guest to have that information, but it's not being required to post outside the property. Unless there's something I've missed. Yeah.
Did we specify internal? Okay. I'm seeing nods.
Yeah. All right, go ahead, please.
Glenn, back to you.
The 200, 250, there's a slide back.
I had a question around the,
Go ahead, Kristen.
if you could go back to slide 7, I had a question around that. Oh, maybe it was slide 6, sorry. It was around the fees, or the, yeah, or the fines, sorry. How did we determine the 200, 250 there? Is that something that can get like, does that cover the recruitment? Does it recoup any type of cost for investigation or decisive or detection technology or anything like that?
I can't speak to that. I don't know if Becky has any thoughts about how the prosecutor arrives at the fines.
No, I mean, there's a range of what the fine, I think for this, it can go up to, I'm going to say $500 to $1,000. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But typically, you're not recommending the maximum fine when you're recommending a punishment for any given offense.
Oh, okay, sorry, this isn't yeah, for some reason in my head, I was thinking it was like a fee to,
And it's not a fee back
yeah, okay.
back to the department.
okay, thanks.
Sorry.
You're fine. Okay, so we're halfway through the slide deck and we're an hour in, so not even halfway, so
well, we
let's,
have 21 slides.
right, I know, so we're not even halfway through, so let's keep going.
All right, well, we did want to present a little bit of data that we've gotten so far on short-term rentals. So I kind of go through this, and then if there's some slides we want to go back to, we can do that. So, again, and just kind of, I think, yell at me if you have any questions, but generally, looking at our total applications and our licenses. So we'll start with the total applications we've received. So it's 162 applications in total, so that represents 58% of those, 94 of them, are conditional use permits. So the application has come in, 94 of the 162 are for conditional use permits, 68 have been for administrative, so more conditional use than administrative. The second one, though, is applications resulting in a license. So they've submitted an application, how many make it all the way through to actually getting a license at the end? So those percentages flip a little bit, so that the administrative percentage now is actually a little bit higher than the conditional use permit. So more administrative, a higher percentage of the administrative ones are receiving licenses than the conditional use permit. So that results in our total of 88 total licenses right now for short-term rentals. So 49 have been administrative and 39 are conditional use permit licenses. There was a little conversation, I think, at our last meeting about just generally how many licenses versus how many dwelling units we have in the city. So the 58,000 number from the total housing units came from, and that's an estimate, I think, from our housing study. So they estimated we have about 58,000 dwelling units in town. So representing that as a percentage of all of our dwelling units, short-term rentals take up about 0.15%. So it's less than 1%. I think on the original one I'd sent out, it was 0.0015. It's a little incorrect math, but so this is essentially saying it's less than 1%. It's 0.15 of 1%. So it just kind of puts in context, I think, the number of units that we're talking about across the city. And in general, each ward is roughly divided into a similar number of residents, so you could kind of do the math to find out approximately how many units would be in each ward as well. So this is the chart where we wanted to kind of show, I think, over time, what that kind of trajectory of applications that we've received for our short-term rental applications and licenses. So the blue would be admin. So you can see really a kind of a big jump, or kind of way it started back in the middle of 2024 was a kind of uptick in those admin applications. Mid-June, which is when I think the ordinance kind of went into effect, you see that big spike in conditional use permits. So we did have a big run in there, and that's about the time the P&Z was started to work out some of these amendments that we're looking at tonight. It was really in the middle of that big spike. And so you can kind of see, I think, some of the concern with kind of that maybe overwhelming our staff resources and system with the number of conditional use permits, because quite honestly, having 15 conditional use permits in a month is from a staff perspective is pretty staggering. That's a lot, right? But we've kind of weathered through that storm through the end of 2025, and we've kind of leveled out now. So really, we see a fairly consistent kind of trickle of applications, not most, but a lot of them being conditional use. So we're seeing a few each month right now. So definitely a drop from that big run within mid-2025. How many do we have per ward? So we pulled those by ward, and as you can see, Ward 4, which I'd say is in good proximity to downtown. It's proximity to campus, to some of the features that many people would be renting short-term rentals for. So it's maybe not as a big a surprise, although I think I've heard a lot of sentiment that maybe Ward 1 has a lot as well, and they do, but they don't quite have as many as Ward 4. So Ward 2 is right behind Ward 4 with 22. And really, if you look at Ward 1 and Ward 4, that's the majority, really, of our license at this point. So that represents 50 of our 88 licensed. So that is a majority of all of our licenses. Ward 2 and 3 kind of in that next tier, and then Ward 5 and 6 kind of bringing up the end there as far as numbers per ward. And really, it's kind of hard to, I think, escape a conversation about where geographically are these distributed. We've hesitated, I think, in the past to kind of show these graphically because of concerns with highlighting where residential properties might be that aren't necessarily habited or inhabited for the full year. But this is something I think we see in other communities. They are sharing this information. So, and there's a lot of ways to get this information. It is all publicly available, technically, the addresses and the licenses. And so just to kind of add, I think, the context that we need to this conversation, we wanted to kind of share, I think, this with this body during the work session tonight. So it's not something necessarily we are continually updating. It's kind of a snapshot in time up to this point tonight. But again, on the right, kind of the breakdown in number per the wards. And so that shows you a little bit of the geographic distribution here. Obviously, quite a bit of concentration, really what I'd call within that stadium kind of loop, right? With 63 on the east and I-70 on the north, with stadium on the other two sides. But then some kind of outside that as well. One thing I'll point out is the color coding here. So we did want to kind of show a little bit on kind of ownership types. Now I'll say that there's a lot of way to slice the data and the information that we have. Ownership or operator type doesn't necessarily line up with a tier or a conditional use or administrative license. This is essentially showing a little bit more owner occupants are those that do really line up with the 30-night and 120-night we have now. So they're ones that are living in there the majority of the year or have indicated that they are owner and occupant. So kind of primary resident. The other three, it can actually span across different tiers and across different distinctions. So you can read as much as you want into that, but really I think the distribution here is key. And so given Ward 1 and Ward 4 were really kind of our top two wards, we wanted to drill down a little bit more to show some that spatial distribution. So again, Ward 4, you can kind of see, again, really a concentration within that stadium loop, but a fair amount really outside that loop as well. Maybe more than you might consider. When you were thinking about this initially, I think we thought, staff, that it'd be a big clustering, really close to downtown, close to the campus, and you see them kind of spreading out further a little bit as well.
I saw a question from Valerie and then Christina on these slides.
On these slides, so this one as well as, I think it's a few slides down, slide 16, what's the difference between the dark green owner occupant and the light green owner?
So light green owner is going to be someone who kind of lists themselves as owner on our application, so not an LLC, but they're not an owner occupant, so they're not falling within that 30-day and 120. So they're most likely going to fall within that tier 2, right? So they're going to be either most generally, they're going to be a conditional use permit applicant.
An individual owner that is not an LLC.
It's an individual owner, not an LLC, and also not a primary resident. So someone who's not living there the majority of the year. So I think a good example, we had someone, I think, come from council before, is they come and live there occasionally throughout the year, but they live out of town currently.
All right, Christina?
On the previous slide, you were showing all the different wards, and maybe this is a question for all of council, but should we be considering like a maximum per ward area or some sort of like restrictions around like the clustering that we're seeing? I ask because if we have a total of just, what was it, 0.15% for the entire city, but all of them are like right there together, like, you know what I mean? Like, it seems kind of clustered.
Well, in the past, we've looked at this, and that was sort of the 300 feet thing, which apparently is whatever. There isn't any reason to say they have to be in different wards. I mean, they want to be closer to either downtown or football games or whatever, so that's...
But so do people that live here.
Well, yeah, that's why we had the 300 foot, and that's why we were trying to carve out whether they were owner occupied or not.
Okay.
Yeah, Valerie?
Yeah, this was discussed in detail previously. I see Becky flagging us, but there was a reason that wasn't pursued based on ward boundaries or even geographical boundaries.
Okay, I can go back and watch the discussion around it. It just seems like very close together and clustered in a certain part of our city. I mean, it's not my ward, so
I absolutely
that's up to you
agree.
guys, but
I
you know.
absolutely agree, and I would like to prevent this, both for First Ward and Fourth Ward, because it is very concentrated in central Columbia.
Okay.
And my understanding was that we could not do that.
I mean, how much can we control what people do with their own property?
Becky, can we legally put a cap on a defined area?
So I think the advice has consistently been that that's not a good avenue to go down. While your zoning powers are broad, you've got to make sure that any conditions and limitations that you put into place are really based on a legitimate public purpose that supports, the health, welfare of the community.
And
There's-
residents?
And
sorry.
there's case law that they're out there that supports like defined distance restrictions. I think outside of that, it gets a little bit more difficult to support.
I'm wondering if our distance restrictions aren't doing what we need them to do, as opposed to putting some kind of cap. Maybe our 300 feet needed to be bigger.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, and I think just want to point out, I think that is the 300-foot component of conditional use. It is meant to address the concerns about density. Again, say it again, it's not determinative, it's not an automatic no. But for instance, the last one we had come before the Planning and Zoning Commission, that was a factor. They did have one within 300 feet, and that was a component of the vote that night to deny that permit. So it is a component of the evaluation, that 300 feet. But that, I think, when this was originally drafted, that was envisioned as the way to control kind of the density and the clustering. The 300 feet was viewed, I think, as the threshold. Now, we can have a conversation about whether that's doing what was intended or not, but I think that was the avenue that was contemplated.
Okay, I can go back and look. It looks very clustered.
Vera?
I think it is clustered, but I mean, that's where people want to be and that's where the owners want to rent out. I mean, this is part of the problem is when we have short-term rentals, that they're going to be where owners want to make money on their properties, and it does affect short-term, it does affect affordable housing. But I don't know how much we can crank down on this and force people to do what we want them to do versus what they should be able to do legally with their own property.
Okay.
It was a long conversation, but I enjoy watching it.
I actually have a question a couple slides back, when you were looking at the percentages of licenses that have been approved. I apologize to go so far back, I've just kind of been mulling on it. Do you have an idea, even anecdotally, I mean, that that 39 out of 94 resulting in a license under the CUP process, is that coming from people dropping out of the process? Is that coming from denials?
I think it's probably a myriad of factors, and I think we talked about this in March. There's not a good way, I think, to make broad statements about why someone doesn't complete the licensure process. They may have started with the conditional use, talk with their business license about the taxes that would be due on that could have become a hurdle. Going through the short-term rental compliance checklist and process could have become a hurdle. So you saw there was kind of a big spike, I think, in the middle of last year. So there could have been perhaps a big run on that of people who thought they might do it and then eventually didn't. But I think there's not one factor per se that I think we're aware of that is kind of preventing them from continuing on in that process. It is something we've talked about lately about, the number that has not completed that and whether some additional, I think, outreach to them to kind of help them, not help them, but just inquire about where they're at with that process so that there's some definitive closure in that.
But the majority of it seems to be self-selecting, is that what you're saying? It's not that we have stepped in and denied that license, it's that they are either paused or dropping out of the process?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know if any insight in that. Yeah, not that I know of per se, of a specific reason why someone going through the conditional use permit wouldn't go on, because quite frankly, that is one of the more difficult parts of the process is going through the conditional use. So they've gone that far, not going further. Could mean that they've, just changed directions at some point.
Are some of those applications that just haven't made their way all the way through the process yet as well?
Yes, there are a few right now that we've received applications in that are still in the process, so that could be, that could kind of explain a few of them, I think, too.
Okay, Betsy, and then we need to move on.
I know a couple of folks who had short-term rentals, and they either decided they didn't want to mess with the paperwork involved with having to pay taxes and all the licensing, or they've done it, gone from an illegal to legal, and then realized that they have to have the whole place inspected, and it's not going to probably pass because they need to paint it or something. So they've gone to midterm rentals or just given up and put some family member in there. So those are the ones I know of, so.
May I ask one more?
Real quick.
Which department handles licensure?
So when it comes to licensure, there's really 2 licenses you're required to have, and 1 conditional use permit potentially. So community development would handle the portion of applications that require a conditional use permit, but all licenses are required to have a rental compliance certificate, is that right? Yeah, and also a business license.
Is
And that would be
there-
our business license, which is in our finance department.
And the application process is handled through,
So the application process really begins with Community Development Department. So there's kind of an application that's submitted to our office up front, and we do the evaluation to determine whether they would need a conditional use process. So if we determine it's not required, then we do forward that on to H&S and business license then for them to complete the process. If we did determine that it does require a conditional use permit, then we start them on that process.
do we have any differences in application process and licensure between tiers?
Not that I'm aware of,
Everyone
except for
goes
the
through
conditional
same
use
process, Except for
process
the
requirement.
conditional use.
All right, please go ahead.
So moving on, I think we, just to kind of pause 1 second on the Ward 1. Again, I think, as you can see, there's a couple overlapping there. This is not to scale. The circle doesn't represent 300 feet per se. But the ones that are overlapping, most likely are ones that include one of them at least being an administrative license. So they are not, they can be granted a license. If you're an admin, you can be granted a license regardless of whether you're within 300 feet of one or not. So that can happen in a commercial district where we don't necessarily, I think, have as big concerns with the clustering. And within residential, if you're, again, owner occupant. And so that was, I think that, again, that requirement or that lower threshold was intended to, I think, help incentivize those that were seeking it, that were owner occupants versus someone who was looking to rent it more than half the year. So this chart here kind of gives you an idea a little bit of how many of our applications, again, are admin versus CUP and who's applying for them. So our owner occupants, vast majority are admins. So the ones that are living there, again, full-time are taking kind of that option to do the admin, so the 30 and 120. Owners, if you're not living there full-time, just by default, you really can't be an admin, so you're falling into that CUP unless perhaps you own a property that's within a commercial district, and then you could have the admin as well. So you can see really the vast majority of the applications we have are admin for our owner occupant groups. I think there's some questions about the ownership, and that's why we focused a little bit on this breakdown. As you can see, out-of-town LLCs represent 7 of our 88 ones. I would say how we determine that, again, is the application materials that were submitted and where that LLC was based on. If it was based on out-of-town, then they're an out-of-town LLC. If you're a local LLC, you listed a address of record within Columbia. I would say that, again, you can see a CUP there or some admins. Some of those local LLCs could have, I think, identified as someone who's also operating it as their primary residence. So there's a little bit of a distinction there. I think the majority of people who are doing this don't have their properties in LLCs. They just have them as owners. And here, we kind of want to break down a little bit then on what are the ownership kind of operator types within each ward. Again, as you can see, our biggest kind of occupant or operator type was that owner occupant. As you can see, in most of the wards, that is the majority of the operators. That's a little bit different within Ward 1. So in Ward 1, the majority of those operating there are not the ones that identified as someone who would be a principal resident or a primary resident of that property. So the majority there is classified just as owner.
Valerie had a question.
I did, and it was a question on owner occupant and the way that it's stated here. Yeah. I think I'm going to pass because verbally it is not quite how I'm reading it here. But yeah, we only have 4 owner occupant in Ward 1, whereas owner occupant is roughly 60 or more % in the other wards, 2 through 6. I think it's a pretty key difference that the people participating in the STR market in Ward 1 are not the residents of Ward 1, and that the residents of Ward 1 are not benefiting from STR commerce.
Any other questions on this slide? No? All right, we'll go on there. And this kind of really just kind of, I think, illustrates where we're at with tiers. Where are most of our applications? And by far, the vast majority, so over 90%, are all in the Tier 2. And so this is where we kind of get into the layers of Tier 2. So on the right side of the pie graph here, Tier 2 is the 120 nights. So that's a principal resident because it's less than half the year. So that's almost exactly half of all of our license. The other part of Tier 2, that is our conditional use Tier 2. So that's essentially, once we get up to the 210 nights, everybody's a conditional use permit. So that represents really a kind of a smaller step down, but again, between those two, that's 90%. So really, we're looking at not too much utilization of that 365 days, which is really relegated to commercially zoned properties. We don't see a lot of that right now. Tier 1, again, only 3 licenses. That was really, I think, put in there as a way then, again, to incentivize owner occupants, but give them the ability to rent it out without really addressing parking. So the impact at 30 days, I think the correlation there was that there would be much less impact on a neighborhood if you're renting it 30 days or less a year. And so even if you want 8 transient guests, we're not going to necessarily make you provide the minimum amount of parking that we're allowing or requiring everyone else to provide. And again, as I think it's an incentive to really allow them to be in the market, but not necessarily put forward, I think, the needed infrastructure to accommodate that 8. So once you go up beyond that, then you are subject to the minimum parking requirements. So that's 1 space for every 2 transient guests.
Okay.
Yeah, Christina.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. And I apologize if you just explained it, but I'm going to ask. So how do you see this graph changing with the proposed? Do you have any indicators of what that would look like if they were re-tiered as opposed to what's currently here?
Yeah, I mean, we expect, I think, the vast majority of everybody to essentially stay in Tier 2. Tier 1 would really go away. So I think the 90% then would essentially be Tier 1. So we'd be capturing everyone, or the vast majority of all licenses within our Tier 1 because it goes up to 210. The exception would be we still wanted to keep a little bit of that allowance for reduced parking requirements for those that are under 120 nights.
Okay.
And so right now it's at 30, and it's no additional parking needed, and we're gonna raise that to 120. So we're not seeing a lot of activity at 30. So we think if we raise it up to 120, we may get a few more people take advantage of that. The difference is it's not completely open-ended. You can have up to 4 guests and not add any parking. right? And I think that's scaled because we're increasing the number of nights. So if you want to have 4 guests and you have no parking on site, you can do that at the new 120 level. If you want to go above that, then you're going to be pushed into the 210.
Thanks.
Valerie? Yeah, my questions that I kind of alluded to in the beginning are between this slide and slide 20. And I'm wondering if you can parse out for me how these tiers fall into the number of licenses for each tier as it's shown on tier 20, on page 20.
I'm gonna jump
And so slide 20 is the chart,
Slide 20 is
the table.
it's 21 now, but it's 20 on what
Okay.
we were.
I did add one extra slide, so I do apologize. So
Yeah, so, we have 3 in tier 1 principal, there's no additional ones. How many do we have in tier 2 principal versus tier 2 that was commercially zoned? How many do we have in tier 2 CUP?
So and I don't think we had that exact graphic, but we have very few, I think, in the commercial zoning. So the vast majority of our tier 2 from slide 17 is going to be the CUP. Let's go back to that. So,
Yeah.
well, there we go. Yeah. So this one doesn't tease out how many of those 210 are the commercially zoned. So I should restate that. There's a few in there that didn't require a CUP, but it's fairly low. Most of those are going to be residential properties, and they all required a CUP.
Can you get me the numbers for this after the meeting?
Yes, how many in tier 2 were, yeah, I think we have that. Yeah,
We
wanted
have
how many
seen
in
that
tier 2 were
before,
versus admin
but not
versus
updated.
conditional use?
Yes, I want to know how many we approved in each tier, each type of the current one, because that's what we're following as we are currently administering the ordinance.
Okay. Okay.
Thanks.
And I may have that, so before we get to the end, I may be able to provide that, so. This is one slide I did add, so I apologize. This was the presentation that was provided on Friday. Didn't include this one, but I did, I think at the last minute decide I wanted to kind of put this up there. But it's a kind of a breakdown, I think, of just conditional use processes, again, and cases. And so, like I said, so kind of walk through how many of those. So we have 39 of conditional use licenses issued. That's from a previous slide, but we started out with 81 conditional use cases, and 80 have gone through planning and zoning. So we have a vote of planning and zoning. So that actually shows that 5 are still pending in city council, or I think maybe 1 or 2 of those were withdrawn. Of all the ones that have been through both bodies, 64 were approved. And where the chart breaks it down a little bit more is the green is the ones, the conditional use permits that were approved in both chambers. So 85% of the time, both plan and zoning and city council approved the conditional use permit. The dark red portion of the pie there is when both chambers denied the same permit. So if you add those up, we're at almost over 95%. So at 95% of the time, plan, zoning, and city council are in agreement on a conditional use outcome. So I think there are 2 each in the other 2 categories. So it's essentially where there's a disagreement. P and Z voted to approve and council to deny, and vice versa. So only 4 times total out of 88 that we've, or 81 cases, excuse me, that come forward, have there been kind of that non-congruence in decision. So I think that's an important just to see kind of where I think both groups stand. We talk a little bit about the criteria. Essentially there is some subjectivity in there, but I think it speaks to the fact that both groups have, I think, found a position and factors that they are looking at, and they're being consistent, and there is some, I think, consistency between those 2 bodies. So I think that's a good sign. I think as we move forward with potential amendments as well. There also a question about revenue, so we want to kind of provide an up-to-date estimate, not estimate, it's actually the actual totals for our revenue. So this is from our lodging tax, beginning from June 1 of fiscal year 2025, so about a year ago. First 4 months, or the 4 months that were included in the past fiscal year was 20,000. This fiscal year to date, it's about 60, so all told, since the beginning of implementation, the lodging tax revenue is almost $81,000. And that tax really became effective on June 1, that's why we're using that number. And actually, I haven't updated this slide. June, this actually includes June as our latest month for data, because there is kind of a lag there when we get the reporting numbers for that. And I would note too that this only includes the lodging tax revenue and not license fees. Those were waived by ordinance through July 1, so just started collecting those within the last month or month and a half now.
Vera?
I have a question on revenue that is also related to enforcement. When we find a property that is out of compliance, are they paying any back taxes for revenue that was lost for the time they were not in compliance?
Great question.
I know you must pay any back lodging taxes if you've been operating prior to getting a license. When they don't go that far, I don't know if I have an answer for that. Is it any? I don't know if we'd have to look into that.
Is that something can you look into that? Thank you.
So just to make sure I'm understanding the question, so if they've gone through enforcement and they've been operating, whether we have the ability to collect the revenue at some point?
Yes. Yep.
Betsy?
Can we go back to, I think it's slide 16? Yeah, the one that, okay. Because like in Ward 1, we have 12 that are owned by a single person and 5 that are local LLCs, but they're not owner occupied, right? According to that slide. So really, that should be local, shouldn't it? I mean, that should be a local,
Not necessarily.
it wouldn't be local?
I mean, anybody can own a place wherever they want.
I think that goes back to the example where he was talking about people who own a house and they live here, like they maybe come back for football weekends, but they actually live somewhere
Okay,
else.
But they actually live somewhere else
Yeah,
and
but
just
they
come back
own the
for,
home,
okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Is that accurate, Clint?
Yes, the way they own the property is in their own name versus in an LLC.
Okay. I'm thinking of people that own one house and then rent out the house next door, but that's not what this slide's showing, so, sorry.
Not exactly, yeah.
Okay.
They could fall in that group and they could not.
Okay, thanks. Other slides?
I'll be going back to that a lot over the next season.
Sounds fair. Oh, Christina?
Not on slide, are we done with 16 before
Yeah,
we jump
what-
around? Okay.
You can go to a different slide from my standpoint, anyway.
I think it was slide 19 where we're showing the fees. Yeah, revenue. Do we have any idea of the cost to administer it versus the cost of
We can collect.
collection? Thank you for helping me finish words.
No problem.
haven't finished my
I
water
knew what you were
today.
asking, is how much is it costing us to administer this program versus how much are we making?
Yeah,
Any idea?
So I can speak from the community development perspective. Well, I can actually speak, I think, from the last report. So there was an estimate that processing a short-term rental license that wasn't a conditional use was, I think, 10 to 15 hours of staff time. If it's conditional use, it's closer to 20 hours of staff time. The conditional use fee, and so that's actually not captured on here because we felt the lodging tax was probably the more, I think, the fee that most people were concerned about. We do charge a $350 conditional use permit application fee. So that covers some of our costs. And that's not short-term rental specific, that's for all conditional uses, that is our standard fee for that processing. And that doesn't include fees for public hearings and notification process, so that's an additional fee as well. The business license, of course, I think they have their fees. I do believe they've had a cost of service study, so they may be able to answer that at some point in the future, but I don't,
I would like to, maybe not to put you on the spot, but maybe if you guys could provide the total information to me in an email or something, but being able to understand the cost of the program versus how much we're spending versus how much is being recouped in total, all the little factors that you mentioned there might be good to know. Go ahead, DeCurlin.
Yeah, so one of the things we're going to talk about at the next council meeting is our cost of service study. And, well, short-term rentals may not specifically be listed as one of the things for community development. It would be easy to add it to, so we can actually show exactly what the cost would be.
I love it. Thank you.
and I'd point out too, with the vendor that we selected, that is, I think an approximately $35,000 contract every year for the provision of the services that they're contributing for identification of short-term rentals. That's the NUMO that
The
we
new,
mentioned. Yeah.
okay, so that would be included. Wonderful. Thank you.
All right, Valerie?
Yeah, the vendor, the data scraping service that we purchased, are we using that data to identify and sweep for non-compliant STRs?
Yeah, I believe the answer is yes. I think H&S staff kind of touched on that in their slides. That is being used to identify potential ones, and it does, I think, assist in identifying things such as reviews that have been online that we do use in prosecution. And again, the NUMO is also the one that is providing the services for the tip line that will be manned 24/7.
Can we use that data scraping service to identify unlicensed STRs within 300 feet?
I think there is, we'd have to look at that. I don't know if I can answer that off the top of my head. I think there is a way to geographically look at some of those, but I don't think you necessarily can, like if we have an application, I don't know if there's the ability to type in an address and say, show me everything within 300 feet. But there's probably a way to dig into that data to find that.
Does it map the data?
I'm sorry?
Does it give you does it give you an address? A location
Yeah.
of non-compliant STRs?
So one of the challenges the vendor has is similar to what I described, is that they're using the data that they can find, the photos, and matching it to our county assessors. But there are still some properties where they're having trouble identifying the location. So there is a map. We do have addresses for those that they can identify. It's not perfect. And what we're seeing is that we've used that dashboard as a resource to identify those that are out of compliance, but it's not perfect. We're seeing some duplication of addresses, some properties that are a longer midterm rental. They show up on their dashboard, but they wouldn't need to comply with this ordinance.
Do you have a follow-up?
What's their identification rate? Do they publish that?
Yes, thank you.
Because I could say that several of the services published their rate that were identified.
I don't know off the top of my head. That might have been included in their proposal when we selected them. We could go back and look at that.
Yeah, it was in a lot of their like promotional materials. I don't know what the actual experience is compared to their promotional material, but I would like to know.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I also agree, because I would, from a contractual perspective, I would want to understand that they're meeting at least the minimum contractual, or as we advertise to us, if they're meeting that, if you're really struggling with that data accuracy. But that's just the tech nerd in me, so sorry.
I just want to have a tool that's useful to us.
Yeah.
Identifying within that 300-foot range has been a difficulty for some time. And that's a tool that can help us validate what we're hearing from the public.
Great. All right, please continue.
And I think that might be, that's kind of the end of the slides. I just kind of conclude, and then I'll probably finish on our chart in case there's some additional questions to think about the changes. You know, one thing we wanted to highlight is we're not suggesting any changes to some of the key provisions of this. And one thing that was key was only one short-term rental per operator is permitted in the city. So that does not change. It hopefully reduces some of the complexity, and I think that was some of the feedback we were getting early on in the process. So I think that informed these amendments as well. But I can say, like I said at the beginning of this, it's been almost a year and a half since these were put together, and I know there have been kind of new things that have been voiced, I think, in the interim with concerns about the short-term rental ordinance and then some of the administration. So that's not necessarily to, I think, undermine anything that's been done here. It was meant to address concerns at that moment in time, and I still think that these are kind of meeting the objectives that were identified at that point. And we could talk a little bit about next steps too here, but we might go ahead and go to the chart and see if there's some follow-up questions about the details. I do want to make sure there's understanding about what we are proposing. It is a little, like I said, it's a little, it can be confusing. So I want to make sure we all have an understanding, I think, of exactly what would change and how those changes are meant to meet some of those objectives that we identified.
Okay, Betsy.
If you go back to one slide back, you talked about the revisions should not reduce the underlying key provision of one license per operator, but haven't we seen more than one short-term rental by an operator? They might have it under a different LLC, or they might be the operator but not the owner. So is that really something that we need to keep in there? And is that, it doesn't seem like it's really enforceable, and I think we had this question about this when we first put this into operation.
Yeah, and I think that has been something we've been able to enforce. I think we have some language in here, and I'd have to pull it up about kind of how we review that, making sure there's no ownership interest in more than one short-term rental within town. So I'm not aware of that being something we have not been able to enforce. And I'll glance back over there, and I don't think I'm getting any other feedback there. I think what we've heard a little bit in there is what we are seeing is kind of repetitive, now I'm losing the term, our designated agents, thank you. So I think we are kind of growing a bit of a cottage industry for that sort of thing, which I think is expected, right? I think, you have an owner, but you do want somebody that is local, that is experienced, and if one person is a designated agent for property and doing a good job in managing that, they may be able to manage more than one. I think this is something that we're seeing more and more. We're seeing some of the same people come forward representing these groups or owners as a designated agent. It's becoming a bit of a professional, I think, role.
Okay, thanks.
Did you have questions, Christina?
Yeah, maybe you already said, has the Planning and Zoning Commission seen this and they agree fully, or do they have any reservations with anything that's been proposed?
Yes, so they held their public hearing June 5th of last year, and so before that, April, May, there was a series of work sessions where staff and planning and zoning kind of went through these, one starting with the objectives and the goals and got down to the draft ordinance that you see before us. I would always hesitate to say they're fully on board with this because they're a 9-person body. What I'd say is this is a draft that they had a consensus approval of. So it may not have necessarily included everybody that every single
Fair.
commissioner wanted, but it's something I think they all felt kind of met what was necessary at that time and was able to be approved with a general majority, if not unanimous vote. And I'd have to go back and look at what the exact vote was this, but that's generally what we try to strive for is having a draft coming out of there that we at least can get really close to having a unanimous decision on.
So Yeah, so you were saying June of 2025.
Correct.
And I feel like the numbers we were seeing kind of like is different than the prior years. So do they have any different opinions about the recommendations or what should be considered since that time?
We have not had any subsequent work sessions on this.
Okay.
To be honest, this draft has kind of been, I think, waiting a little bit.
Oh, okay.
We did have it in March, but just given the schedule of council, we weren't able to come back again until now. So it's been even longer, I think, since
Yeah,
that
over a
time.
year.
And that's just the way it is. But yes, I would acknowledge, I think some circumstances have probably changed, but they haven't revisited it because it was kind of at this stage where it needed to be looked at by council.
You guys have anything?
Yeah. I want to say that I want to acknowledge planning and zoning and their work in this, both staff and the commission. I know that the commission tends to be fairly hands-on in drafting, and this did come to us after detailed work. It passed to us in a 6-3 vote. And I think that shows support in what was given to us. I still have my concerns. I don't believe that we have been successful in preventing impacts to available housing in the first ward. And I think that's what I'm seeing on slide 16. I've kind of alluded to that pretty directly, but in the research that I did on STR data, a lot of the people doing that work identify the percent of owner-occupied listings as an indicator of health. What I'm seeing here is that in Ward 1, it's less likely, it is more likely that an STR is not rented by the person who lives there. And I'm concerned that that does deplete affordability. If you are living in the same house that you are renting out, you are not depleting something, you are doing something that is pro-housing. I'm not seeing that trend for Ward 1. I don't know what parameter we need to add to help that. I don't think that this change in ordinance improves that situation at all. I think that this change in ordinance supports what we are currently doing, but I don't think that it makes it any better. I think it makes it more efficient, but I don't think it makes it any better for my ward.
Do you have any suggestions as to what would make it better? I mean, do we need to get rid of licensing STRs in general? I don't know whether that's illegal or whether anybody else in the country has done it, but I mean, I don't see how we can keep this from happening if we allow it to go on in the city. Right now, it sounds like we have less than 1% of residential.
Can you
Did I
tell
have
me
that
how
right?
many we've approved that were not spaced by 300 feet? I think that was in here somewhere.
I don't know if I had that exact breakdown.
The only
So
thing
how many existing licensed SERs do have a property within 300 feet? I don't think it's a high number, but it is occurring, yes.
The two things that I can think of to be more effective in that would either be increasing the radius or making the draw between owner-occupied versus non-owner occupied. I don't think the days make a big difference compared to the type of ownership.
Did you have during your research, did you find anything that said, like, if it's more than 5% rentals or STRs, that makes it worse for that neighborhood? Because we obviously have a ton of rentals, period, longer-term rentals or midterm rentals, but Did you find anything that said short-term rentals needed to be less than 5% or less than 2% or less than?
I
There
don't
is
think they
research.
drew a distinct line, it needs to be less than this to be healthy. I think
needs to be
that
less than
they
1%?
compared economics of rent prices in some cases to types of ownership, and tried to parse that out. I think that that's less direct. I'm not sure if there's a simple line, but I don't like that. I don't like that that STRs in the first ward are less likely to be owned by people living in the first ward. And that's a jump in itself. STRs in the first ward are less likely to be operated by someone who lives in them. But we would have to get a different set of data to look at how many operators live in which ward.
Glenn, do you know how many overall licensed short-term rentals we have? Not the, not the breakdown of whether they are CUPs or not, but just how many licensed short-term rentals we have in the city?
Total for short-term rental?
In the city?
It's 88 licenses.
Total?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Are you done, or do you have something more?
I will be done with that.
You're done for now? Okay. Do you have anything, Vera?
I don't think so.
The only question I had was the feedback that I've received most often, or the, emails in person, was a concern about any change in neighbor notification. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so right now, if you apply for a conditional use permit, and that's not just related to short-term rentals, but we do send out notification to all property owners within 185 feet. That is the extent of public notification for licenses. So it only affects those that are going through a conditional use permit. So say an owner occupant, 30 night, since it's just an admin, there is no notification for surrounding property owners currently within the ordinance. So, and I don't think that was part of the conversation. I think we did have some conversation about notification in March. But as it stands, as it's drafted right now, this ordinance doesn't contemplate adding any notification requirements.
Is it taking away notification with the change in tiers?
I think the goal there, or at least the outcome, would be to reduce conditional use permits, assuming that just as many or more people could avoid those criteria. Then it could reduce notification for ones that had been notified prior because they went through the conditional use process. So just by its nature of trying to reduce that, additional review process, it's going to reduce the notification.
So anyone for the 210 nights that don't trigger the 300 feet or code violations would be admin and wouldn't have the notification to their neighbors?
Correct.
Okay. Betsy?
Is there a time that this is going to come back to the city council, or what? Maybe if we haven't all finished our questions, but mine's like, when are we going to see this on a council agenda, or when are we going to have a public hearing, or what are the next steps to
So,
this?
yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question. So I think, we don't have too many work sessions, I think, for text amendments, so it's a good thing to kind of work through where we want to go next with this. So I think there's some options here. If there's a consensus to bring this particular draft in front of council, and I think it would be probably well-suited maybe for a vote tonight, we would put that on a future council agenda. That would be the next step. Other options could be, if there are specific revisions that council would like to see, we could perhaps entertain some amendments to this. I think depending on what the scope of those are, they could happen one of two ways. We could make some, I think, targeted kind of surgical changes to this and still bring that forward to council. If, say, they said, well, we don't want it to be 300 feet, we want it to be 350 feet. I think that's something we could bring back to council. We could make that. If it's something that's a little more dramatic and substantial, it may warrant having another public hearing at planning and zoning. And so if there's something that's a little more broad, the council doesn't have specific direction on, but they wanted us to look at different things or things not contemplated in the first one, we'd probably go back to planning and zoning and say, here's some direction from council on additional changes to this amendment. The last part of that is if the consensus here tonight is that this draft doesn't necessarily still align with what I think the priorities of the short-term rental is currently, it's something that we'd essentially just go ahead and close the book on this specific amendment. That is, and then we wouldn't bring it back to council. And that might be something I would suggest if we want to revisit it, say in a year, allow basically the short-term rental process to work for another calendar year through June. Let it kind of operate with the tip line in place now with some of the other things that we have. And then if there's additional desire by the council to kind of look at some revisions in the future, then we could have that conversation then. So there's a range of options that we could do.
So when you say dramatic, what's dramatic?
I think anything that changes kind of the intent of what was here, and I looked at Becky for some head shaking, but that's generally my threshold, and that's something I think we discuss internally. If you say we want to add a notification requirement per se, I think that's something that wasn't even contemplated before, so we'd probably go back and have a hearing on that.
So that would be dramatic. Okay. Well, I'm going to vote for dramatic then, because that's like 99% of the feedback that I've received on this has been on the neighborhood notification, and people are very concerned about that. So I would like to see this move forward more quickly, since it has been kind of on our radar and in discussion for over a year. But that's something I personally would like to have included, yeah.
Yeah, if I could just take a minute, just kind of, I think, share some conversation we've had internally. So I think there was conversation in March about two distinctions between notification, one coming kind of early in the process, during the licensure process, and one coming after a license was issued. I think my suggestion would be, I think there's some inherent difficulties with the first part, with notifying just when we have an application in place. I think if there's a desire to have some notification, I think the after notification is much more straightforward in implementing and administering. So that would be essentially, we'd notify anyone within a certain distance once a license has been issued. And that would give us an opportunity then to provide them with information about short-term rentals, provide information about the website with the tip line, and explain that there is a process to report these and a process to have perhaps a short-term rental license revoked if there are kind of continuing violations.
Yeah, that
So
was
that,
gonna-
I think, is it's a little more straightforward approach.
That was going to be my point, because I think people are worried about licenses being given without neighbor input. And so that's kind of where I'm hung up. Yeah, that's where I'm hung up. Did you have a question? No? I thought I saw your hand.
Yeah,
Okay.
kind of a question, kind of a comment. I think I would like to see, if we do a notification, do a little bit bigger radius, because there are points where the 300 are meeting together, and so those residents that are on drives where they're already seeing increased traffic, you know, where that merges, like maybe they, I don't know, like maybe 300 or something, I don't know. I'm throwing it out there. I'm not saying it has to be, but
Okay, so
the
we,
overlay between where one rental is versus the other, where they, you know what I mean?
I know what you mean, yeah.
Thanks. The proximity, that's the word I was
There you
looking
go.
for.
So it is 7:54, and we need to provide instruction or requests on how to move forward.
Yeah.
Thoughts? Opinions?
I'd be tempted to put it off for another year. I hate to say that, but get your tip line or your report line in, see how this works for the next year. It looks like we've certainly decreased this a lot. Alternatively, we could bring this back and then see and make these changes and see how that works for a year. And that might be better because we've done all this work already. It might be worth bringing this in with some amendments, whether it's the 300-foot notification, making sure that we have the 1-800 number, and then see how it goes for another year. I guess that would be my recommendation versus, much as I'd like to put it off, then we have to start this all over again.
Right.
We've already spent enough time on it, I
There's a
think.
lot of, yeah, time spent.
That'd be my recommendation.
just given the time spent, I don't want to put it off. I also don't think that this addresses my concerns.
Right. I'm not sure what's going to address your concerns. I don't know what we can do to change this that's going to address your concerns.
I think it's the radius and the spacing. Is there anything that prevents us, you brought up the opportunity to notify residents after approval and give them information about the complaint line, about what it means. Are we doing that now? Do we give them the complaint line when we send out the postcard for notifications? Or when they come to interact with us?
Yeah, so the tip line has not been included in that. That may have been a suggestion just recently passed to me, so I think it is a good idea. One thing I'd say about the tip line, I know we're running out of time, is it's been live for a little bit of time, but only within the last couple of weeks have we been confident to put it out there. So really, the August, I think, newsletter was one of our first opportunities to say, hey, this is happening. Tonight was another opportunity, I think, to kind of put it out there and say, we do have a tip line now, and we'll be working, I think, with our communications team to put it out there a little bit broader, so that the general public's aware of it and how to report it. And I would say it is manned 24/7, and so it is designed to be calling in, I think, on the weekend and after hours, and hopefully put them in contact with the registered agent to address any concerns also. So a lot of benefits to that.
Might be nice if we could mail those out, though, like just a postcard saying, there's a short-term rental, or there are short-term rentals in your area. If you have any concerns, you can call this number.
Yeah, we could probably put that on our conditional use permit notification that goes out now for the time being, too.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's,
Okay, so I'm seeing hands, but it is 7:57, and we need to provide some direction. Do we have a consensus that we're asking staff to bring this back with some amendments?
Yes.
with
For
some
me.
amendments?
Yeah.
The
What we've
amendments
talked about
being-
tonight, so I'm hearing the radius, I'm hearing the notification. Those are the two big ones. The radius between STRs and then how we're notifying neighbors. That's what I'm hearing.
And notify neighbors about the 1-800 number,
Yes.
and otherwise going forward with these changes that we've just been discussing for the last 2 hours.
Do we have
Yes.
an idea of the radius amount, or is that
300
something the
feet.
staff would bring back to us?
I think that's something staff would bring back.
When you're saying notification, are you talking about notification before or after the license?
I'm talking about before.
I'm talking about
I'm-
both.
I'm hesitant, I don't know if I'm at consensus with that. I'm hesitant to do notification before the license when we haven't yet seen how this tip line works and whether that's going to change, particularly as we hear the neighborhood services line so far has 100% rate of sending these complaints to enforcement. Very small test size, but, so I'm hesitant to add another procedural loop for our staff when the line might be solving that problem for us.
So what you're saying, so what don't you want to do that Jackie's,
I'd be interested in notification after the license, or at least I don't think in these 5 minutes I'm ready to give consensus on notification before the license, is more what I'm saying.
Is it possible for staff to come back with a comparison? Oh, I'm sorry.
One thing I think it's important to note is asking what the purpose of notification before. When we're notifying for the CUP process, that's because there's a public process that's happening with it. When you're notifying and it's truly an administrative process, I mean, it should be, you're looking at the ordinances when you get this application. If it meets these criteria, there's a license that's granted. There's not this discretionary process that happens when you're considering the CUP, where public comment would come into your decision-making because of the criteria that are there for the CUP. If it's an administrative process, it's truly just that.
boxes.
Yeah.
so that would mean if the neighbors are opposed to it, it makes no difference.
Right?
Correct.
Yes.
Yes.
From an administrative part, yes.
And I think we'd run into confusion that if they're notified ahead of time, they have a role to play
Right.
in the granting that license when they don't necessarily, if it's administrative. So afterwards, I think it's clearer.
Yeah, except part of this whole issue was if the neighbors are opposed to a short-term rental is that it does affect neighborhood character. And so what we're doing is we're taking that completely away and saying it's okay to have a business anywhere within 300 feet of some other business.
If it can be approved administratively. We would notify people ahead of time through the conditional use process, which we already do. So the only ones we'd be notifying after a license is issued is for administrative ones.
Yeah, and we're changing a lot of those to become administrative.
Yeah, so like, I think the one thing you talked about was the radius. And so if you shrink that 300 feet, that still would establish it as a COP. So it would go for conditional use, which means that you do the notification, and it would go before the planning commission and the city council for approval. And so I think that's the distinction.
So reducing the radius for like the 300 foot.
Correct.
Reducing it? I thought,
So right now,
Increasing.
so right now, if it's
I'm
over
sorry.
300 feet, then it would go for a conditional use per process. If you, what Valerie was saying is shrink that radius.
No.
Oh, okay.
Increase,
I'm
yeah.
saying
increase the
increase the radius.
increase the
Right
radius.
now,
So
if
if you
there
increase the radius,
is
then-
another STR within 300 feet,
It's conditional.
that is something to consider on the conditional use criteria.
And so if you increase the radius,
And
then that
in
would-
our proposed amendments, if there's another one within 300 feet, it would go to CUP.
Correct.
I'm saying maybe that should be more than 300
Right. And
feet.
so
Maybe
if
that
you
should be.
increase that, then that would cause.
And I'm
cause-
not sure how we look at that to avoid the clustering. I'm not sure what the appropriate radius is.
Is that something staff can bring back?
Yeah, we
Please.
could come up with some suggestions on a radius, a different radius than the 300 foot. I think that's what I'm hearing, right?
Yeah,
That's
for
in the
the,
ordinance
for
right now.
the objective being to decrease the possibility of overlapping or close dense STRs, right?
To reduce the potential of
The density.
impacting character in a neighborhood or.
It's not about character.
It's about
And
homeownership.
It's
housing
about
availability.
having
But-
more homes used for commercial purposes in a concentrated area and less homes available for long-term rental or homeownership. Rentals are just as important to me.
Okay, so do we have a clear direction?
Do you want to just repeat it real quick?
Sure,
would
so
say no.
I'm sorry.
I would say no, but go
Okay.
ahead and try.
I'll try to summarize. What I'm hearing is for staff to bring back suggestions on increasing the radius?
Increasing the
Increasing the
radius.
radius. Or the distance between licensed STRs, what that would look like, what the administrative process would be, if it makes it worse, if it makes it better. Which I think we know the answer to that, but that's what I'm hearing. Because that would also then be the trigger for the notification, because if we have fewer, then it's going to automatically trigger. And so that takes care of the neighbor notification, I think, piece. Does that,
what would the timeline of that be?
Bringing back the amendments,
Yeah. Guesstimate.
I would think with our current items we're working on, it may be after the first of the year.
at the end of this year or first of next year, is that what you said?
Yes.
Does that need to go through another P and Z hearing?
From what I've heard, my initial reaction would be, I think it might warrant another hearing, yes.
So it would go to P and Z at the end of the year or to council at the end of the year?
I'd hope to be back to council maybe by the end of the year. So we might be able to have a hearing and/or maybe work session with planning and zoning before the end of the year.
I feel like at that point, we'll just be in a very similar spot where we will have very little data about how the enforcement line is working. We will still be in this like constantly fluctuating how many applications we're getting or not getting each month. Like, we're looking at this, which was made a year ago in a very different environment. I am on the side of like the wait
Wanna
and
wait?
see.
Yeah, I think.
I
that
won't be
was-
against further conversation. I just don't know that in 6 months, even with the additional information, will have like, for lack of a better term, environmental scan that we need to decide what the changes should be.
What
I
if
don't
it
think
goes
it-
back to like planning and zoning in 6 months, like January or February? So then that would give you another 6 months of data pretty much. So a number those numbers would change. And it would give them a chance to look at the amendments that we've discussed here.
I don't think it's fair to send it back through P and Z again so soon. I mean,
They had it
this
a
is
year
what they
ago.
wrote and proposed and voted on and passed to us.
So you think it should just come back to council sometime next year?
I think
We wouldn't have a public
I
hearing
think
then.
either it comes to council and we amend it if we think it needs amendments, or we wait.
And
To
give
be
it a year.
perfectly transparent, I'm not very comfortable in removing principal residence. I do want simplification. I still think that that is an important parameter. So I don't know that I would vote to have it come back to us as it is.
So do you not want it to come back at all, or you want to give it another year, or you want to put, and on top of that, we're past 8, sort of, so we need to like come up with some idea.
We're not going to come up with an answer from the dais right now.
Okay, so should we put this off
We
for
take a vote.
6 months or a year?
What is the vote for? I just want to clarify.
Giving the staff direction on whether or not to come back to us, and if they are to come back to us, what they come back to us with.
Did you make a motion?
I didn't hear what. the
Becky's
motion
got
was.
some
Go ahead.
suggestion.
And I don't know what your I understand your past practice has typically been during work sessions, not to take votes on items,
Right.
but to provide
Yeah.
a
A
consensus.
direction.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm tripped up by the fact that we're sitting at a dais.
Yeah.
I don't think we have a consensus, though.
I don't think we do either. Because I'm hearing a lot of different things. I'm hearing, let's wait for more data. I'm hearing we need several amendments. I'm hearing we need a single amendment.
Could
To
we
Carlin,
maybe-
I'm gonna throw this to you. What are your thoughts? The most efficient way for us to move forward here.
Yeah, I think, Betsy's suggestion about let's wait a year and just see if we get the data from the hotline, looking at exactly what's going on for how that process is moved forward. We'll also have enough additionals if, considering our conditional use process, and so we'll have more data to look at it, see exactly what's happening. And so that gives us a little bit more time. Right now, we're talking about 88 properties out of 58,000, so it may warrant a little bit more time.
And how does staff feel about that?
I think that's a good approach. I think with, you're right. I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of perspectives still and not a consensus. So that would be my recommendation, I think, to kind of follow up into Carlin's is let us come back in that kind of May, June timeframe with a report and update the data and see what everyone's goals and priorities are at that time.
What's going to change our opinion on that data? Is it going to be like 100 more, rentals done? Or is it going to be 5 more? What's
I
that?
think it's going to be the longer time that we've had to implement the changes that we put in place to see if they're working or if they're creating more problems, is my understanding.
Yeah, so one of the questions you were talking about is the hotline, that just went into effect.
Yeah.
So we don't have any data from exactly how many calls we've gotten, what does that look like? And so this will allow us at least a little bit more time to track.
So do we have a consensus to bring back a report next May or June and then determine if we want to move forward with amendments?
I would. I
Yes.
would be agreeable to that.
Yep. I see a
I will
shrug.
shrug.
She's shrugging.
Christina?
Christina?
I just think, I think a lot of people are expecting us to be able to make decisions a little bit faster and move faster. And I think this is an example of we're
Yeah.
pushing it off because we're afraid to make a decision. But I'm okay with waiting if that is the consensus here. I would like us to just move forward, honestly, because there's a ton of stuff that we have going on.
I agree. And I don't think it's that we're afraid to make a decision. I think
Oh,
that we're trying to make the
maybe
best
that was a
decision.
bad
Yeah, we're
wording,
trying to
but-
make the best decision with the data that we will, or
Yeah.
have just started gathering. So I'm hearing at least for
Yeah,
let's wait, report coming back in May or June.
okay.
Does that sound feasible?
I think that would be just fine.
Perfect. All right. Is there any like really quick other council issues that we need to discuss? Like nothing major, any other? Okay, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and call it. It is, what time is it? 8:10. Thank you, everybody.